3 hours. That's how long the doors stayed closed. Not during a game, not after a loss, but in the middle of what was supposed to be one of the quietest, most routine stretches of the basketball calendar, a Team USA women's basketball camp, with no cameras, no headlines, no expectation of drama. The kind of environment where reps blur together and decisions are usually saved for later. And yet, behind those closed doors, something shifted in a way that everyone inside the building would feel immediately, but no one would explain publicly. What makes this moment unsettling isn't that anything visibly exploded. There was no shouting match, no leaked audio, no viral clip to dissect on social media. Officially, nothing happened. No announcements followed, no lineup changes were posted, no quotes were given. But when those doors finally reopened, the mood had changed. Coaches spoke differently, players moved differently. Conversations restarted with a carefulness that hadn't been there before. The kind of atmosphere you only get when everyone knows a line was crossed, even if no one says it out loud. According to people familiar with the situation, it all traced back to a single detail that landed heavier than anyone expected. A name written into a starting rotation, not as a hypothetical, not as a long-term projection, but as a present-tense decision. Caitlin Clark. And the moment that happened, the temperature in the gym changed. Conversation stalled. Eyes followed possessions more closely. Every movement carried a little extra weight. That's when phones were put away. That's when doors were closed. And that's when a routine camp quietly turned into a 3-hour reckoning. Because this wasn't really about one scrimmage or one rotation or even one player. It was about what happens when a system built on balance encounters a kind of gravity it can't ignore. Team USA's program has been defined for decades by control, hierarchy, and continuity. Roles are clear, sacrifices are expected, stars exist, but they fit within something larger than themselves. That structure has produced dominance so consistent it almost feels automatic, which is exactly why moments like this are so destabilizing. When everything works, you don't question the blueprint, until suddenly you have to. To understand why this landed the way it did, you have to zoom out. This camp wasn't about today, it was about 2028, Los Angeles, a new Olympic cycle already underway, whether fans realize it or not. Every possession now is being logged mentally, every interaction evaluated. This is where hierarchy quietly starts forming long before rosters are announced. And when a player enters that space carrying not just elite skill, but attention, expectation, and undeniable pull, the evaluation process changes, not dramatically, subtly. And those subtle shifts are often the hardest to manage. What made this moment so uncomfortable wasn't conflict, it was recognition. Recognition that the next era might not slide neatly into place. Recognition that certain players don't just add value, they bend the environment around them. And recognition that once you feel that bend, you can't unfeel it. That's why this wasn't a loud moment. Power doesn't usually announce itself when it arrives. It settles in quietly and waits for everyone else to adjust. If you've been watching the women's game closely, this probably doesn't surprise you. You've seen how one presence can stretch defenses before the ball crosses half court, how ratings spike, not because of matchups, but because of who's on the floor, how conversations shift from box scores to influence. This wasn't new energy entering that gym, it was familiar energy finally placed inside a structure that wasn't built for it. And that's where the real tension began. Because once that door closed, the question stopped being hypothetical. Not could this work someday, but what does this mean right now? For the coaching staff, for veterans who've earned their status the long way, for rising stars who've always been the center of their own universe, and for a program that suddenly had to confront whether tradition and balance are enough in an era where gravity matters more than ever. And just like that, what was supposed to be a forgettable day became the moment Team USA realized the ground might already be moving beneath them. This camp only looks quiet if you're not paying attention. From the outside, it feels early, almost irrelevant. 4 years out from the next Olympics, no medals on the line, no pressure from the public, just another checkpoint in a long timeline.
But inside the program, this stretch matters more than most people realize, because this is where direction is chosen before it ever becomes visible. By the time fans are debating rosters and rotations, the real decisions are usually already months, sometimes years old. Paris is done. That chapter is closed, whether the emotional fallout has settled or not. Once an Olympic cycle ends, Team USA doesn't reset, it recalibrates. And that recalibration starts immediately. The players invited now aren't just being evaluated for what they can do in a vacuum. They're being assessed for how they scale under pressure, how they respond when roles tighten, and how their instincts translate when the margin for error disappears. Every rep becomes a data point. Every interaction quietly answers questions no one is asking out loud.
What separates these camps from regular season basketball is that nothing here is accidental. Minutes aren't handed out to build confidence. Lineups aren't just experimental for fun. Even the casual stretches are intentional. Coaches are watching who naturally leads without being told, who adapts when the ball isn't coming back, who stays effective when their comfort is disrupted. This is about alignment as much as talent, because Olympic basketball isn't forgiving. There's no time to grow into roles once the lights are on. You either fit or you fracture. That's why the energy in these gyms always feels different to those who've been through it. Everyone knows what's at stake, even if no one says it. Veterans feel the pressure of time. Younger players feel the urgency of opportunity. And the coaching staff is balancing two truths at once: respect what's worked and prepare for what's coming. That tension alone makes these camps volatile under the surface, even on days when nothing dramatic appears to happen. This particular camp sits at an especially sensitive point. It's the first real step into the 2028 cycle. No assumptions are locked in yet, but impressions are forming fast. The hierarchy isn't written in ink, but the pencil is out. And once those early outlines are drawn, they're hard to erase. That's why decisions that might seem small, who initiates, who starts, who gets deferred to, carry outsized weight. They signal intent, they suggest direction. And in a program built on clarity, even subtle signals matter. For players, the calculus is immediate. This isn't about proving you belong at this level. That's already been established just by being in the room. It's about proving you belong in this version of the team, the version that's being shaped now, quietly, with an eye toward Los Angeles and the expectation of dominance that comes with it. Every possession asks the same question in a different way. Can you elevate what's already here without demanding it bends too far around you? That's what made the moment in this camp hit differently, because when something disrupts that evaluation process, when one player's presence forces conversations earlier than planned, it changes how everyone is being seen. The timeline compresses, decisions come forward. What was supposed to unfold gradually suddenly demands attention now. And once that happens, the camp stops being routine altogether. It becomes a checkpoint the program didn't expect to reach this soon. You can describe the skills first if you want. The range that stretches past 30 feet, the vision that finds shooters before defenders finish rotating, the confidence to pull from spots most players are still trying to get to. On paper, that's the resume. Impressive, but not unfamiliar at this level. Team USA camps are filled with elite shot makers and high IQ guards. If this were just about talent, this conversation would be simple. But that's not what separates Caitlin Clark from everyone else in that gym. What makes her different is what happens to the game around her. Defenses don't wait to react. They load up early. Bigs hedge before screens are even set. Help defenders cheat a step higher, knowing that one late rotation can turn into a three-point swing. The floor doesn't feel the same when she's on it. Spacing stretches, timing speeds up. Teammates make reads they wouldn't normally make, not because they're told to, but because the geometry of the game demands it. That's not a skill set you toggle on and off. That's gravity. Gravity changes responsibility. When a player carries that much attention, the offense orients itself whether you design it that way or not. You don't need to run plays to feature her. She features herself by existing in the action. The ball finds her, defenders find her faster, and everyone else is forced into quicker decisions because hesitation gets punished. That kind of influence is uncomfortable in structured environments, especially ones built on shared control. Because once gravity enters the equation, equality becomes theoretical. The game starts to choose sides for you. This is where the tension begins to surface. Team USA's identity has always been rooted in balance, multiple creators, interchangeable options, the ability to win without leaning too heavily on one player. That model has worked because the talent pool has always been wide enough to support it. But Clark doesn't blend into balance, she redefines it. Asking her to exist as just another guard in the rotation doesn't neutralize her impact. It actually amplifies friction because the game naturally wants more through her than the structure is prepared to allow. There's also the pace she brings, which often gets overlooked in stat breakdowns. She doesn't wait for actions to fully develop, she accelerates them. That's energizing when it clicks and destabilizing when it doesn't. In a short tournament environment, pace can be weapon or liability depending on how well it's synchronized, and synchronization requires buy-in from everyone on the floor, not just to run sets, but to accept that the rhythm will feel different than what they're used to. Some players thrive in that chaos, others need predictability to be at their best.
And then there's the part no one likes to talk about directly, even though everyone feels it. The attention follows her. Cameras, ratings, online conversation. The women's game has entered a moment where basketball value and visibility are intertwined in ways they never were before. Pretending that doesn't exist inside national team environments is unrealistic. Coaches can say the focus is only on winning, and that may be true, but winning now happens under brighter lights than ever. When one player draws the world's eyes, the room shifts, expectations shift, pressure shifts. This is why Clark's presence can't be managed the way traditional stars have been. She's not waiting her turn. The game doesn't allow it. Every possession with her on the floor quietly asks the same question. Are we going to organize around this reality or fight it? And that question isn't strategic as much as it is philosophical. Because organizing around gravity requires concessions. It requires redefining roles. And it requires some players to matter in ways that look different than what their resumes suggest. That's the crossroads this camp brushed up against. Not whether Caitlin Clark is good enough, no serious voices debating that, but whether a program built on controlled balance is ready to accommodate a force that naturally pulls everything toward itself. Once that force is felt in real time, the idea of easing into the future disappears. The only options left are adaptation or resistance. And that's when the room starts to feel heavier, even when no one says a word. That gravity doesn't land in empty space. It enters a room already filled with players who are used to shaping the game themselves. And that's where things get complicated, because standing on the same floor is another player who has spent her entire career being the system rather than fitting into one. Paige Bueckers didn't arrive at this level as a complementary piece. She arrived as an organizer, a stabilizer, a player teams orbit around because everything runs cleaner when she's involved. For years, her value has been rooted in control. Control of tempo, control of space, control of decision-making. She doesn't overwhelm the game with volume the way some stars do. She solves it. Reads develop a half-second faster around her. Mistakes shrink. Possessions feel intentional. That kind of presence is deeply respected in elite programs because it translates under pressure. When things tighten, she tightens with them. That's why in most environments, you build outward from her without a second thought. But when two system shapers share the floor, one thing has to give. Not because either player lacks professionalism or willingness, but because basketball ultimately demands hierarchy. Someone initiates, someone reacts, someone bends while someone else holds. And the adjustment required to move from being the center of gravity to becoming a satellite, even temporarily, isn't tactical, it's psychological. It asks a player to rewire instincts that have been reinforced at every level they've ever played. According to people familiar with the dynamic, this camp created moments where that adjustment was unavoidable. Not through confrontation, but through repetition, through possessions that naturally flowed one way instead of another. Through lineups where the offense felt more urgent when one player dictated pace and more methodical when another did. No one had to say anything for the contrast to register. Elite players feel these shifts immediately. They know when their influence is being tested, even when it's not being challenged directly. This is where outside narratives tend to get it wrong. It's tempting to frame this as rivalry or competition, but that misses the point entirely. This isn't about insecurity or ego. It's about identity.
When you've spent your entire basketball life being rewarded for control, efficiency, and balance, being asked to adjust to someone else's gravitational pull can feel like erasure, even if it's not intended that way. The question stops being, "Can we coexist?" and becomes, "Who am I in this version of the game?" And that question doesn't get answered quickly, especially not in an environment like Team USA, where roles are supposed to be earned slowly and respected long after they're established. For a player like Bueckers, adaptation doesn't mean shrinking, it means recalibrating how her influence shows up. Less visible command, more off-ball manipulation. Finding impact without owning every decision. That's a hard shift for anyone, no matter how gifted or selfless they are. What makes this moment especially delicate is that both styles are valid, both win, both have proven themselves at the highest levels. One destabilizes defenses through audacity and range, the other stabilizes games through precision and control. In isolation, you'd want either on your team without hesitation. Together, they force clarity earlier than programs are comfortable with. They force choices about rhythm, hierarchy, and sacrifice that usually get postponed until stakes are unavoidable. That's why the tension in this gym didn't feel emotional, it felt evaluative. Everyone involved understood that no one was wrong, but not everyone could be central in the same way at the same time. And once that realization sets in, the conversation shifts from talent to fit, from ability to alignment. And that's when silence becomes instructive. And that's when a camp stops being a tryout and starts becoming a referendum on what the next era is actually going to look like. Here's the part that almost never gets said publicly because it cuts too close to the core of how elite programs justify themselves. At this level, the problem isn't talent, it's excess. Too many players who are accustomed to being central. Too many resumes that, in any other environment, would demand the ball, the tempo, and the final say. And when that many accomplished competitors are compressed into one gym, hierarchy stops being implied and starts demanding definition.
Coaches know this better than anyone. They also know how dangerous it is to articulate it directly. You can't walk into a room like this and say, "Some of you are going to matter less than you're used to," even if it's true, even if it's necessary. Instead, the message gets delivered indirectly, through rotations, through usage patterns, through who initiates when things tighten, and who suddenly finds themselves spacing a little wider than before. These are the signals players read instantly, long before anything is verbalized. On paper, this is the dream scenario, the deepest guard pool in the world. Wings who dominate professionally being asked to become glue players. Bigs who are focal points at home, learning to influence games without touches. In theory, this creates matchup nightmares for opponents. In reality, it creates an internal calculus that has nothing to do with skill and everything to do with role compression. Because when everyone has the pedigree to justify centrality, someone still has to sacrifice first. That's the tension threading through this camp. Not frustration, not conflict, but an unspoken understanding that the math doesn't fully work unless identities shift. A system built on balance only functions when that balance feels fair. But fairness becomes subjective when roles shrink. One player's adaptation is another player's demotion, depending on where they're standing. Coaches can design lineups all day, but they can't design how those lineups feel to the people living inside them. What makes this even more complex is that Team USA's dominance has historically protected it from these conversations. Winning covers friction. Gold medals validate compromise. As long as the results are unquestionable, the internal strain rarely spills into the open. But during transitional moments, new cycles, new faces, new gravity, that protection thins. The program has to solve problems before the world forces them into the spotlight under real pressure. And the coaches feel that clock. They understand that Olympic basketball doesn't offer a long runway once competition begins. There's no time to experiment on the fly or hope chemistry finds itself. The clarity has to be there before the lights come on. That's why moments that seem small from the outside take on massive significance internally. A starting rotation in practice, a closing lineup in a scrimmage, a possession where the ball goes one way instead of another, each becomes a test of alignment.
The hardest part? Every single player in that gym has done exactly what the system has asked of them in the past. They've sacrificed, they've adapted, they've waited their turn. Asking them to do it again, especially when the reason isn't performance but structural necessity, requires a level of trust that can't be rushed. Coaches can encourage it, but they can't force it, and pushing too hard, too early, risks cracking something you can't easily repair. That's why the real problem here isn't about who starts or who sits, it's about timing, about whether the program can redefine centrality without destabilizing the foundation it's built on for decades. That's the conversation happening behind closed doors, in careful language and measured tones. And it's the one thing no press release will ever capture, even though it's shaping every decision being made on the floor. It didn't happen with fanfare. No whistles stopped practice, no speech was given. The rotation was written the same way hundreds of others have been written before it. Names on a card, positions slotted in, a small administrative step in a long day of work. And yet, when that card made its way into view, the room reacted in a way that couldn't be coached or controlled, because this one carried meaning far beyond the drill it was attached to. Caitlin Clark wasn't listed as a future option or a situational look. Her name was there as a present decision, a starting role, even if temporary, even if unofficial. That distinction matters at this level. Starting isn't about ego, it's about signaling, about who the offense begins with, about whose rhythm sets the tone. And once that signal went out, everything else in the gym recalibrated without a word being spoken. Those who were there described the same thing. The energy shifted instantly. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Eyes stayed locked on the floor longer than usual. Possessions were tracked with extra attention, not because anyone was trying to make a point, but because the stakes had quietly risen. Players feel when context changes. They know when evaluation sharpens. And this felt like one of those moments where the invisible rules were being rewritten in real time. What made it unsettling wasn't disagreement. There was no visible pushback, no tense exchange, no open resistance. In some ways, that's what made it heavier. Silence at this level is rarely passive, it's analytical. Everyone was processing what that lineup implied, not just for this scrimmage, but for how decisions might start stacking if this direction held. Because starting once is easy to dismiss, starting twice becomes a pattern, and patterns create expectation.
That's when the phones went away. That's when the doors closed. Not in response to conflict, but in response to awareness. Awareness that this wasn't something you could let drift without discussion. When a program is structured as Team USA senses a hinge moment, it doesn't rush through it. It stops and examines it from every angle. What does this unlock? What does it complicate? Who benefits? Who has to adjust? And how quickly do those adjustments need to happen to avoid confusion later? Inside that meeting, nothing dramatic needed to be resolved. The goal wasn't to crown anything or tear anything down. It was acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that the floor tilts differently when Clark initiates, that decisions downstream feel different, that certain combinations gain urgency while others lose control. These aren't criticisms, they're observations. And observations at this level carry weight because they're rooted in lived reps, not hypotheticals. The uncomfortable truth is that once a coaching staff sees something like that clearly, they can't unsee it. Even if the lineup never appears again, the awareness lingers. Every future decision now lives in its shadow. Who closes games? Who absorbs pressure possessions? Who the offense naturally seeks when the clock is tight? This is how hierarchy forms, not through announcements, but through moments that reframe what feels possible. That's why this rotation mattered, not because it settled anything, but because it accelerated everything. It pulled conversations forward that were supposed to unfold over months. It forced the program to confront a choice between letting gravity organize the game or resisting it in service of symmetry. And once that choice becomes visible, even briefly, the room never quite returns to neutral. The drill ends, practice continues, but everyone leaves knowing something shifted and that the ripple from that shift is going to show up again when the stakes are higher and the margins are thinner.
What comes next is where certainty ends and quiet conversation begins. Nothing about this stage is official, and it's important to be clear about that. There has been no public declaration of direction, no confirmed plan laid out for the future. What follows is what's been said to be discussed in private, according to people familiar with how elite programs navigate moments like this. Not decisions, possibilities. And understanding those possibilities helps explain why that closed-door meeting mattered as much as it did. One path, and historically the safest one, is patience. Reports suggest this option leans on what Team USA has always trusted: time and clarity. Let the discomfort breathe. Slow everything down. Define responsibilities carefully without forcing a pecking order too quickly. In this scenario, rotations become staggered with intent. One creator runs the show while another rests. Roles are firm within specific lineups, even if minutes fluctuate. No one feels replaced, just redistributed. This approach prioritizes harmony and minimizes shock, but it also requires belief that gravity can be managed rather than embraced. It's controlled, familiar, and lower risk, at least on the surface. There's another idea that's been quietly floated, one that requires more trust and more surrender from everyone involved. Some reports claim the concept of hybrid hierarchy has already entered the conversation. Lineups where multiple high-level creators share the floor, but with defined lanes instead of shared authority. One player sets tempo, another becomes the closer. Decision-making shifts depending on context rather than rank. In theory, this could unlock a terrifying level of versatility. In practice, it demands restraint from players who've been rewarded their entire lives for instinctively taking control. It's not chaos, but it's not comfort either. And then there's the outcome no one likes to talk about openly, but everyone at this level understands exists. Sometimes fit and timing don't align. That doesn't equal failure. It doesn't imply wrongdoing. According to speculation, there's always the possibility that preserving long-term chemistry means certain players step back from the process, at least temporarily. Whether that looks like focusing on the WNBA grind, load management, or recalibrating priorities, those decisions are usually quiet and mutual. They rarely feel dramatic in the room, but they echo loudly outside it. From a player's perspective, this math is deeply personal. Is wearing USA worth fewer on-ball reps? Is a gold medal worth reshaping how you've always played? Is adaptation a short-term challenge or a permanent adjustment? There's no universal answer. Bodies matter, careers matter, contracts matter, legacy matters, and none of that disappears just because the jersey changes. What's critical to understand is that none of these rumored paths involve blame. No one, according to what's been said, crossed lines or made demands. The tension exists precisely because everyone involved is excellent, because everyone has earned a central role somewhere. This isn't dysfunction, it's friction, the kind that shows up when a game evolves faster than the systems designed to manage it. That's why this moment feels so fragile. The decisions being debated aren't about today's practice or tomorrow's lineup. They're about what kind of dominance USA believes in moving forward, whether it's built on careful balance or organized around undeniable gravity. Those conversations are happening quietly, without quotes or confirmation, but the fact that they're happening at all says more than any announcement ever could.
From the outside, wearing a USA jersey feels like the simplest choice imaginable. The highest honor, the biggest stage, a chance at gold that defines careers. But inside the gym, the decision isn't nearly that clean. Once you move past the symbolism, the question every player is quietly answering becomes more personal and far more complicated. What does this cost me, and is that cost worth it right now? For players who are used to controlling games, the trade-off is immediate. Fewer touches, fewer possessions that start and end in their hands, less freedom to dictate tempo when instincts tell them to push or pull. Olympic basketball compresses responsibility, and not everyone loses the same amount. That imbalance isn't a reflection of talent, it's a reflection of fit. And understanding where you fall in that equation can feel like a reckoning, especially when your resume suggests you should be central.
There's also the reality that these are not abstract sacrifices. Careers are finite. Bodies absorb contact differently with each season. Contracts don't pause for national team commitments. The WNBA schedule doesn't soften just because international expectations exist. Every minute spent adapting to a different role is a minute not spent reinforcing the habits that made you elite in the first place. For some players, that trade-off feels manageable. For others, it raises long-term questions they can't afford to ignore. Then there's identity. For years, the message at every level has been clear: lead, take responsibility, impose your will. Those traits are celebrated, rewarded, and amplified. Being asked to selectively turn them down, even temporarily, creates an internal friction that's hard to articulate. You're still competing, you're still contributing, but you're doing it in a way that feels quieter than what got you here. And quiet impact doesn't always feel like enough when you've been trained to associate value with visibility. This is where players diverge. Some see adaptation as growth, a test of versatility, proof they can influence games in any context. Others see it as erosion, a gradual moving away from the version of themselves that made them special. Neither perspective is wrong. They're shaped by experience, security, and where a player is in their career arc. A veteran with hardware and legacy behind them weighs these decisions differently than someone still building their claim. What often gets lost in public debate is that choosing a role on Team USA is still a choice. Participation isn't compulsory. Commitment isn't unconditional. Saying yes means accepting a defined version of yourself for that window of time. Saying no doesn't mean stepping away from excellence. It means prioritizing it differently. And in moments like this, where roles are in flux and gravity is being negotiated, that choice carries even more weight. That's why this tension doesn't resolve neatly. It lives in conversations behind closed doors, in long silences after practice, in mental calculations players make long before anything is decided. It's not about resentment or resistance, it's about self-preservation, about understanding where you fit in a vision that's still being written, and deciding whether that vision aligns with who you are right now. And when you stack enough of those individual calculations together, the stakes of every coaching decision become clear. This isn't just about building the best lineup on paper. It's about building one that players can fully commit to without losing themselves in the process. That's the dilemma sitting underneath the rotation debates and speculative paths forward. And it's the part of the story that never shows up in box scores, but shapes everything that follows. What's happening inside this camp only makes full sense when you zoom out far enough to see the landscape around it. Because this tension didn't start in that gym, and it won't end there either. Team USA is just the most visible pressure point right now, the place where everything the women's game has been becoming finally collides with its most established system. The shift has been building for years, but this season accelerated it. The WNBA didn't just grow, it changed temperature. Arenas that struggled to fill seats suddenly sold out. Broadcast numbers jumped in ways the league had chased for decades. Conversations moved from niche spaces into the mainstream, and a big part of that surge came from one undeniable truth. Certain players don't just play games, they turn them into events. When they're involved, everything feels louder and more consequential. That's where Team USA gets pulled into something bigger than roster math. National team basketball has always been about excellence, but it's never had to seriously account for the attention economy the way it does now. Players no longer arrive carrying only performance expectations. They arrive carrying fan bases, online discourse, media gravity, and business implications that follow them onto the floor. Ignoring that doesn't make it disappear. It just means you're unprepared when it starts shaping reality anyway.
There's historical precedent for this, even if the context looks different. When Diana Taurasi was in her prime, Team USA didn't hesitate to center her. When Sue Bird ran the offense, everything flowed through her vision and command. Balance has always existed, but it's never meant sameness. Dominance, historically, required accepting that certain players reshape the structure rather than blend into it. What's changed is the scale. The spotlight is brighter, the reactions are faster, the scrutiny is constant. For veterans who carried this program through years when visibility was harder earned, the sudden intensity around one figure can feel destabilizing, not because they doubt their own value, but because the environment they mastered is evolving underneath them. That discomfort is real, and it deserves acknowledgement rather than dismissal. This is why fans are so divided right now. They're not arguing because they don't understand basketball. They're arguing because they're watching two valid philosophies collide in real time. One prioritizes continuity, trust, and a system that has delivered gold with ruthless consistency. The other looks at a once-in-a-generation gravitational pull and asks whether playing is safe is how you leave potential untapped. Both views come from wanting to win. They just disagree on how. Team USA finds itself at the center of that crossroads because it represents authority, tradition, proof of concept. If this program adapts, it signals permission for the rest of the sport to follow. If it resists, it sends a different message, that evolution must bend to existing structures rather than reshape them. Either way, the decision echoes beyond one roster or one Olympic cycle. That's why this feels bigger than a closed-door meeting or a debated rotation. It's a referendum on how willing the system is to move with the game as it accelerates, on whether gravity is something to be managed cautiously or embraced deliberately, and on how much change a dominant program believes it can absorb without losing itself. Whatever direction Team USA ultimately chooses, one thing is already clear. The questions raised in that gym aren't temporary. They're the same questions the entire women's basketball ecosystem is grappling with right now. How do you honor what built the game while making room for what's pushing it forward faster than ever? That tension isn't a problem to solve once, it's a reality to navigate. And the way this program responds will help define what the next era of the sport actually looks like. What happened behind those closed doors wasn't a breakdown, it wasn't a crisis, it was recognition. Recognition that the game is asking a different set of questions now, and that the old answers, as successful as they've been, may not fully apply anymore. No one left that room with a final decision in hand. No hierarchy was rewritten. No direction was formally announced. But something far more important happened. The program acknowledged that the ground is shifting, and once you do that, pretending everything is stable is no longer an option. That 3-hour meeting wasn't about solving tension. It was about naming it without inflaming it, about admitting that certain styles of play don't fit neatly into systems, they reshape them. And reshaping a system as dominant as Team USA's doesn't start with tactics or lineups, it starts with identity, with asking elite competitors to imagine contributing in ways that may not mirror the version of themselves that earned their reputation. That's a harder adjustment than any defensive scheme or offensive set. What makes this moment so delicate is that no one is wrong. The balance that's delivered gold for decades deserves respect. The gravitational talent pushing for adaptation deserves seriousness. Ignoring either would be a mistake. And that's why this conversation didn't end when practice resumed. It will resurface in future camps, in rotational experiments, in high-leverage possessions when instincts take over and decisions become visible to everyone watching. The hierarchy hasn't been rewritten yet, but it's no longer theoretical. Everyone involved felt it hovering. Coaches who understand what it takes to stay ahead of the curve, veterans who know how quickly eras pass, emerging stars who sense opportunity but also responsibility. That awareness doesn't fade, it lingers, quietly shaping how people prepare and how choices get framed going forward. And that's the key distinction. This moment wasn't about choosing sides. It was about accepting that evolution doesn't ask for permission. The women's game has accelerated, and with that acceleration comes discomfort, recalibration, and moments of friction that don't fit clean narratives. The hardest part isn't acknowledging the talent, it's deciding how boldly to reorganize around it before the world forces that decision under brighter lights and higher stakes. Whatever Team USA decides, the process itself matters, because systems that endure aren't the ones that resist change the longest. They're the ones willing to absorb it without losing their core. The conversations happening now, in quiet rooms over long hours, without public pressure, are laying the groundwork for what comes next, not just for a roster, but for how this era understands leadership, gravity, and sacrifice. Once the game shows you what it wants to become, there's no rewinding the moment of recognition. You can delay, you can soften, you can try to manage around the edges, but you can't unsee it. And when the lights get brighter, when the margins get thinner, and when the stakes turn these questions into public ones, everyone involved will remember the day they realized the floor had already started moving beneath them.